The officers laughed at the black woman dressed as a homeless person in court. And it wasn't just laughter, it was mockery. They tore into her dignity as though it were a joke passed around during a coffee break. One officer leaned toward another, smirking, and muttered, "Look at what the streets brought in. She probably doesn't even know what a toothbrush is." Another officer chuckled, "She'll probably ask the judge for a sandwich instead of a lawyer." They weren't whispering. They wanted her to hear, to feel the full weight of their disdain. And she did. She sat there quietly, head lowered, her coat tattered, her fingers clutching the fabric as though it was her only protection. Her face partly obscured by a tangled mess of hair and grime. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. But what no one in that courtroom realized, not the judge, not the public defender who barely glanced at her case, nor the officers who had dragged her off the street 2 nights ago, was that this wasn't her first time in court. This time, however, she wasn't here to be judged. She was here to expose the very act of judgment itself. She had entered the courthouse like a ghost from society's blind spot, unseen, unheard, unwanted. Every gaze that fell on her saw nothing more than a problem to be processed and discarded. But this wasn't an accident. She had chosen this disguise, had studied every look of contempt, every dismissive gesture, every lazy assumption. And now, wrapped in the very image they despised, she was here to confront it all. Months earlier, she had received an anonymous tip that triggered a chain of complaints ignored by internal affairs, covered-up body cam footage, and reports that vanished without a trace. Something was happening inside this police department. Something systemic, something ugly, and she wasn't about to turn away from it. But for the plan to succeed, she had to disappear. She had to become someone the system would overlook, someone these officers would never see as a threat. They played right into her hands. From the moment they spotted her hanging around a grocery store, pushing an empty cart, and rummaging through a trash bin, they decided she was guilty of something, though they didn't know what. They didn't ask questions. They didn't offer warnings. They grabbed her, laughed, shoved her into the back of a patrol car, and booked her for trespassing and resisting arrest. The charges were flimsy, but that didn't matter. In their eyes, she was already trash. One of them muttered, "Same damn story with these people." That phrase echoed in her mind for hours as she sat in a holding cell designed for 10 but crammed with 23. Not a single officer stopped to ask if she needed medical attention, if she had eaten. No one cared enough to check on her. Now, sitting in court, waiting to be processed like countless others before her, she heard the officers stand against the wall, grinning with their arms crossed, satisfied. She had become the punchline to a joke they'd been telling their entire careers. The judge barely looked up. The public defender scrolled through his phone under the table. And yet, she said nothing, because everything was unfolding exactly as planned. What they didn't know was that this case wasn't real. What they didn't know was that their badge numbers had already been flagged. What they didn't know was that the woman they had dragged in, the one they mocked for smelling like the gutter, had spent the last 8 months collecting testimonies, footage, and data, all tying at least 5 of them to misconduct, abuse of power, and civil rights violations. What they didn't know was that the people watching the courtroom feed from an unmarked van down the street weren't journalists. They were federal agents. What they didn't know was that the courtroom had become a trap, and they had walked right into it. But this story isn't about revenge. It's about justice in disguise. It's about how deep the roots of prejudice run and how invisible the truth becomes when it doesn't look the way people expect it to. It's about a woman willing to be humiliated, spit on, and degraded, just to make sure the system couldn't continue hiding behind its polished uniforms and fake smiles. She gave up her name, her comfort, her safety, all for one undeniable, inescapable moment. What happened next wasn't on the court schedule. It wasn't on the docket, but it changed everything. Imagine a courtroom frozen in time, officers' faces draining of color, the judge speechless, cameras rolling, lives unraveling in real time. One woman standing up, not as a defendant, but as the one in control of the entire operation. She wasn't there to plead guilty. She was there to take them all down. But how did she do it? And why did it leave the entire city talking for months afterward? Stay until the end of the story because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about justice, power, and appearances. Before we continue, we want to speak directly to every Black viewer watching this video. Here at Plow of Twist, we firmly stand against all forms of racism, injustice, and discrimination. This channel is a space that uplifts truth, dignity, and the power of turning pain into purpose. If you've ever been judged for the color of your skin before the content of your character, this story is for you. And remember, your worth is never up for debate. Enjoy this powerful twist and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that move, shock, and inspire. She was the kind of person most people never noticed unless they had to. Not because she lacked presence, in fact, she stood out profoundly, but because she moved like someone who had learned to exist without being seen. Her name was Danielle Brooks, and for most of her life, she had been the kind of woman others underestimated until it was too late to undo the mistake. Danielle was tall, with skin the color of polished mahogany and eyes that carried a quiet intensity, a fire that never went out, even when hidden behind a mask of indifference or calm. She walked like someone who had weathered storms and survived them all. And when she spoke, her voice was low and deliberate, as though every word was carefully chosen. To those who knew her, who truly knew her, she was resilience personified. But few could say they really did. Born and raised in the west side of the city, Danielle had seen Baltimore through every lens. The lens of a child walking to school in worn sneakers, the lens of a teenager navigating streets she had no business being on, and later the lens of a law student at Morgan State University, determined to become something more than the statistics predicted. Her mother, Clarice, had worked 2 jobs most of Danielle's childhood: janitor by day, caregiver by night, and still managed to keep food on the table and rules in the house. Her father, a former mechanic, had been absent since she was 10, but his absence taught her the value of presence in ways he never could. Danielle's path into law enforcement wasn't inspired by courtroom dramas or justice TV shows. It came from something deeper, more painful. A quiet rage that had been with her since her older brother, Jalen, was stopped one night on his way home from work, accused of loitering, and beaten so severely he spent 3 weeks in the hospital. The officers involved claimed he resisted arrest. The city called it an unfortunate escalation. Danielle knew it was neither. Though the charges against her brother were dropped, nothing happened to the officers. No suspensions, no investigations. Just another young Black man brutalized and forgotten. That night changed her. It sparked something inside her that law school alone couldn't satisfy. It was why, after graduation, she turned down corporate firms and polished marble offices and instead joined the FBI. Not for the badge, not for the prestige, but for the opportunity to change something from within, no matter how long it took. Years passed, and Danielle rose through the ranks slowly and strategically. She was wise enough to know when to speak and when to listen, when to show her strength and when to conceal it beneath silence. Her work centered on internal corruption and abuse of power, often buried deep within systems protected by politics, race, and legacy. It was slow, often thankless work, and sometimes left her more frustrated than fulfilled. But each case she took brought her closer to something that felt like justice. It was during one of those cases, a follow-up on a whistleblower complaint within the Baltimore Police Department, that she uncovered a pattern she couldn't ignore. Minor infractions leading to excessive force, reports of intimidation and silence among new recruits, body cam footage that was edited or mysteriously missing. And at the center of it all, a handful of names that kept resurfacing. Officers all working at the same West Precinct where her brother had been brutalized. The city had changed, but not enough. Danielle knew this case would be different. It would take more than paperwork and quiet inquiries. The stories weren't being told on paper. They were hidden in interactions no one recorded, buried in fear and silence. She had seen this darkness before, the kind that lurked behind protocol, behind policy, behind smiles and badges. The kind that couldn't be exposed from the outside. That's when the plan began to take shape. Disguises weren't foreign to Danielle. Undercover work had been a part of her past, though it was rare and reserved for situations where no other method would work. This time, however, she would go further than ever before. She wouldn't just pose as someone else, she would live it. She would vanish from her role, disappear completely, take a leave that few would question, and re-emerge on the streets unrecognizable, forgotten, just another shadow in a city full of them. And so Danielle Brooks, respected agent, relentless investigator, became invisible. She carefully selected her new identity. Layers of mismatched clothes, a coat torn at the seams, hair matted and tucked beneath an old knit cap, nails dirty, skin coated with grime, and a cheap blanket always wrapped around her shoulders as if she were clinging to the last warmth of a forgotten world. She moved through the city like a ghost, sleeping under bridges, sitting on corners, walking down alleys, collecting fragments of conversations, observing patterns. People ignored her. Shopkeepers shooed her away. Police officers passed her by as though she were part of the pavement. But she was always listening, always watching. Then, one night, everything changed. She was resting beside an old grocery store dumpster when 2 squad cars pulled up. She didn't flinch. She had rehearsed this moment. An anonymous call had been made. A suspicious vagrant spotted near the store's back entrance. Within minutes, flashlights hit her face. Commands were shouted. Hands gripped her, pulling her up without hesitation. The moment her eyes met those of the officers, their posture made it clear this wasn't about upholding the law. This was about asserting dominance. She didn't resist. She didn't speak. That was part of the plan. Let them see what they wanted to see. They shoved her into the back seat, treating her like trash. One officer chuckled, saying he'd probably catch fleas now. Another muttered, "She's lucky we don't wash the streets with fire hoses like back in the day." Danielle stared at the city lights flashing through the cage between them, reflecting on how easily they'd stripped her of her humanity without knowing anything about her. The holding cell smelled of urine and bleach, and the cold was unbearable. No food was offered. A nurse came by to ask if she was mentally fit for trial, barely glancing her way. The next morning, she was given no phone call, no explanation, just escorted into a courtroom like a spectacle for others' amusement. That's when it happened. The courtroom wasn't crowded, but the eyes that were there bore into her. A judge who barely looked up, a public defender who sighed as he flipped through her file as if already exhausted by her existence, and the officers who brought her in, standing off to the side, arms crossed, smirking. They made comments loud enough to carry, their laughter echoing off the marble walls. One leaned over to another and said, "Bet she doesn't even remember her name." They all laughed. Danielle remained motionless, not because she was scared, but because she was collecting everything. Every sound, every insult, every glance. It was all being recorded, not just in her mind, but by the hidden microphones sewn into the seams of her coat. They had no idea that every breath they exhaled in arrogance was being documented. They had no clue they had already walked right into her investigation, and their laughter was about to become Exhibit A. But for now, she stayed silent. She let the courtroom unfold exactly as they expected. She let them follow the script they had written for so many others before her. Soon, however, the narrative would shift, and none of them were prepared for it. The fluorescent lights in the courtroom hummed faintly above her as Danielle sat still, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed slightly downward, avoiding eye contact with a world that had already made its judgment. The room was filled with the cold hum of routine, a place where stories like hers were processed, not truly heard. One by one, people passed through, shackled to narratives written by others, expected to plead, to nod, to disappear. Her file was thin, deliberately vague, meant to attract minimal attention. But what the file lacked in depth, the room made up for in assumptions. Her silence, her posture, her appearance. Everything about her was used to tell the story they wanted to believe. And every second she stayed seated, enduring the snide glances and suppressed chuckles, she added another brick to the wall she would soon tear down. Danielle could feel Officer Daniel's eyes on her, a man whose name had come up too many times in complaints that mysteriously led nowhere. He stood with an air of arrogance earned from years of unchallenged authority. Next to him, Officer Meeks leaned against the back wall, arms crossed. Chewing gum like this was just an afternoon game. She overheard him say to another officer, "You'd think she'd at least pretend to have some dignity. Look at her. Bet she smells like the inside of a sewer." The man next to him laughed, trying to hide it behind a cough. The judge briefly glanced up, said nothing, and moved on. The public defender assigned to her didn't even introduce himself until moments before the hearing began. He slid into the seat next to her, shuffled through some papers, and without looking at her muttered, "Trespassing and resisting arrest. First offense, probably. I'll try to get you a deferred judgment, maybe some community service." Danielle didn't respond. He glanced at her impatiently. "Do you understand what I'm saying? Just say, 'Yes, Your Honor,' and we'll be done here." She turned to him slowly, meeting his gaze. For the first time, he hesitated. Something in her eyes, the clarity, the control, didn't fit the narrative they had written. But he quickly brushed it off, returning to his paperwork, dismissing it as either luck, pride, or perhaps just delusion. The judge called her name. She didn't flinch. The public defender stood and began speaking, his voice a monotonous drone of formality. But before he could finish, the judge interrupted. "Let's make this quick. We've got a full docket today." Danielle remained seated. It wasn't time yet. She could feel the moment approaching, like a train rumbling down the tracks. Still distant, but impossible to stop. After court adjourned, she was escorted back to the holding area, her wrists loosely cuffed. A protocol for appearance's sake. Officer Daniels walked beside her, speaking low enough so no one else could hear. "You people never learn. Always think the rules don't apply to you. Maybe a night in jail will remind you of your place." She didn't answer. Her silence was a blade, and she knew he could feel its edge, even if he didn't understand it. Later that night, inside the cell, Danielle lay on the hard bench, her body aching from days of rough sleeping. Her mind, however, was sharp. She went over the timeline again. The microcamera embedded in her coat had captured everything. The comments, the behavior, the lack of legal counsel, and the dismissive attitudes. Tomorrow she would appear again, and the day after that. Each appearance would add another layer to the case she was building. A case not just against a few rogue officers, but something much larger. But against an entire culture within the precinct that had been allowed to thrive without consequence. Back at the Bureau's mobile command center, miles away, her handler, Special Agent Moreno, monitored the live feed, his fingers typing out transcriptions, annotations, and timestamp notes. The operation, codenamed Ghostwatch, had been authorized at the highest levels. But only a few within the agency knew that Danielle was undercover. The stakes were too high, the exposure too sensitive. One slip-up, one misplaced word, and the entire mission could collapse. Worse, Danielle would be left dangling in a system designed to discard people like the one she was pretending to be. The next day, during her second court appearance, the same officers were present. This time, Daniels leaned casually against the courtroom wall, his phone in hand as he filmed her. "Got to show the boys this later," he whispered. "She looks even worse today." Meeks chuckled and muttered something Danielle couldn't quite catch, but the tone was enough. The judge again rushed through the proceedings, clearly irritated by her silence, her refusal to play the role of the ashamed defendant. The public defender sighed audibly as he left the bench. "You know, if you just cooperate, this would all be over," he told her in the hallway. "Whatever chip you've got on your shoulder isn't going to change anything." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Each word, each exchange was being stored, streamed, archived. She wasn't just gathering evidence. She was gathering truth, the kind you couldn't erase from a report. 2 days later, a woman named Trina, a real unhoused woman Danielle had met during her first week on the street, was dragged into court in exactly the same manner. Her arm was bruised, her eyes swollen. Danielle watched from her seat in the back as Trina stood trembling before the judge, unable to articulate what had happened to her. Her court-appointed attorney didn't seem to care. And once again, Danielle stood in the back, smug, detached, unbothered. That night, Danielle sat beside Trina in the holding cell. "They beat you," she said softly. Trina nodded, tears welling up. "Said I was talking too much. Said I needed to learn to shut my mouth." Danielle placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "They will answer for it." I promise. That promise wasn't empty. The file was growing thicker by the hour. Audio, video, interviews, documented violations, breaches of protocol. The Department of Justice had already been looped in. If things went according to plan, the next court session would be the last they had to fake. Everything was in motion, but Danielle felt the weight of what was to come pressing down on her chest, like a storm on the verge of breaking. The night before the final session, she received a coded message embedded in a news clip sent to a burner phone she had hidden in a drainpipe outside the shelter. Operation greenlit. Strike window confirmed. Execute phase 3. That was all it said, but it was enough. Inside the precinct that night, officers joked about her again. You see her sitting there like a broken dog? Daniel said, his voice echoing through the hallway. Next time I'll bring a muzzle. Bet she bites. Meeks chuckled. She don't bite. She barely breathes. Trash like her? They don't fight. They just rot. Danielle was in the next room, close enough to hear every word. She didn't sleep that night. She didn't eat. She sat upright, her back against the wall, her eyes wide open in the dark. Not from fear, but from focus. She thought of her mother, her brother, and every person who had stood in a courtroom just like hers. Hidden in plain sight, invisible in the eyes of those with power. She thought of Trina. She thought of all the voices silenced, not because they were wrong, but because they weren't believed. Tomorrow, those voices would speak through her, through everything she had endured. And as dawn crept through the thin slit of a window high on the cell wall, she closed her eyes for just a second and whispered to herself, they think they've won. But what they didn't know, what they could never have guessed, was that by laughing at her, they had opened the door to their own collapse. And now all that was left was to let the truth walk in. Courtroom 2B wasn't any different from the others in the building. But that morning, the air inside felt denser, heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The benches filled slowly with the usual crowd, court officers, a few sleepy lawyers, and a small gathering of people waiting for unrelated cases. The judge took her seat as casually as she had all week, shuffling papers and checking her docket without looking up. Daniels and Meeks leaned casually against the back wall, just as they always did, already smirking at the sight of Danielle being let in. Her shoulders hunched beneath her tattered coat. The shackles clinked faintly with every step she took, and she moved as if her body weighed more than it had the day before. But her eyes, hidden beneath tangled hair, scanned the room with precision. She wasn't watching the judge. She wasn't watching the officers. She was watching the door. The public defender, the same one from earlier in the week, didn't bother sitting down immediately. He leaned against the table, flipping through the same file he had barely touched. Trespassing, resisting, he muttered, then glanced at her. Same deal today. You just need to speak this time. One word, and we're out of here. Danielle slowly lifted her head, her eyes meeting his with a stillness that unsettled him. She didn't speak, but the way she looked at him was like watching a storm take shape behind glass. The judge cleared her throat and tapped her pen twice on the wooden bench. Let's move this along. We've got a full docket today. She glanced down at the paperwork, then directly at Danielle. Miss Brooks, this is your third court appearance. You've refused to speak or accept counsel. Do you understand the charges against you? There was silence. The public defender leaned in, exasperated. Come on, just say yes. Danielle slowly stood upright. She didn't respond to the judge. Instead, she turned toward the gallery, toward the officers, and then toward the door. At that exact moment, it opened. Two men entered, suits, clean-cut, no badges visible, but they didn't need to announce themselves. The way they moved, the way the guards stiffened at their presence, made it clear. Federal. One of the men carried a leather briefcase. The other had a thick folder in his hands. They didn't take seats. They stood near the center aisle, calm and waiting. Daniel straightened slightly, glancing at Meeks, who had stopped chewing his gum. The judge's voice faltered. Can I help you, gentlemen? The man with the folder stepped forward. Yes, Your Honor. We're here in reference to this case. What's the Department of Justice doing involved in a loitering charge? the judge asked, half joking, half wary. The man placed the folder on the clerk's desk, opening it slowly. Because this isn't a loitering case. He paused, turning to Danielle. And the defendant, he said, is not who you think she is. The room shifted. The tension wasn't sudden. It spread slowly, like cold water creeping under the skin. The judge blinked, unsure if this was real. Excuse me? Danielle's hands moved to the front of her coat. Her fingers, steady and calm, unclasped a hidden fastener. From beneath a fold of the lining, she pulled out a black wallet. She opened it slowly, deliberately. Inside, the gold badge of a federal agent gleamed under the courtroom lights. I'm Special Agent Danielle Brooks, FBI. The silence that followed felt physical. It wasn't disbelief. It was something deeper and awakening. The realization that every assumption, every smirk, every word had been built on a lie. Danielle stepped forward, removing her coat entirely. Underneath, she wore a simple, clean black blouse. Her posture straightened, like a spine unfurling after weeks of compression. I've spent the last 47 days embedded in the streets of Baltimore as part of an undercover operation authorized by the Department of Justice, she said, her voice cutting through the room. I've documented over a dozen incidents of misconduct, abuse of power, and systemic failure, including what occurred inside this very courtroom. Daniel's face had gone pale. Meeks had taken a step back. The federal agent with the briefcase approached the bench. Your Honor, we are submitting a motion to dismiss all charges against Special Agent Brooks and to enter into the record a federal investigation into Officers Daniels, Meeks, and several others within the West Precinct. Daniels stepped forward again, his voice shaky and defensive. This is a mistake. She's lying. She assaulted an officer. Danielle turned toward him, her expression unreadable. You want to talk about assault, Officer Daniels? Would you like us to play the audio from the patrol car 2 nights ago? The part where you threatened to break my ribs for not moving fast enough? Or maybe the footage from Trina Harris's arrest? The one where she was handcuffed and you still shoved her face first into the squad car? Daniels opened his mouth, but no words came out. Meeks muttered, "This is insane. She set us up." Danielle walked toward them, slow and steady, her voice unwavering.
No.
You set yourselves up. I just gave you the space to show everyone who you really are. The judge looked like she had aged 5 years in 5 minutes. This courtroom has procedures. This is irregular. No, Your Honor, the agent interrupted. What's irregular is what's been allowed to happen here. What's been normalized. That ends today. The room was no longer a courtroom. It had become a stage, and the curtain had just fallen on the first act. Reporters had started to arrive, tipped off anonymously moments before the reveal. Cameras clicked. A few flashes went off. Danielle didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed fixed on the men who had dragged her into court, who had mocked her humanity. They were shrinking before her, bodies rigid, faces drained of the smug confidence they once wore like armor. Do you know what it feels like? Danielle began, her voice lower now, not for the courtroom, but for them. To be treated like you're invisible? To be spoken about like you're less than garbage? I do. And I made sure every second of it counted. Daniels tried to step forward again, but the second federal agent raised a hand. I'd stay where you are, officer. You're being placed under federal review, effective immediately. You'll be escorted out of here as soon as we're finished. Danielle picked up the coat she had left on the defense table. She folded it slowly, with care, as if paying tribute to the role she had played. Not just the disguise, but the lives of those who wore that coat in real life. People without badges, without protection, people who weren't pretending. As officers from Internal Affairs entered to begin the formal arrest and suspension procedures, Daniels called out one last time. You think this changes anything? You think anyone cares? Danielle looked at him. Not with rage, not with triumph, but with truth. Yes, I do. And more importantly, now they can't ignore it. The room simply watched as the powerless became powerful. watched as a badge hidden in rags became a sword of justice, watched as silence turned into a reckoning. But what no one knew yet was that this courtroom revelation was just the beginning. What Danielle had uncovered went far beyond Daniels and Meeks, far beyond the West Precinct. And what she was about to reveal next would shake the city to its core. Daniels sat in the cold interrogation room on the 9th floor of the federal building. The fluorescent light above him flickered faintly, casting sharp shadows across his face. His badge was gone. His service weapon, his ID, all stripped from him in the last 2 hours. He was still in uniform, but now it clung to him like a costume on a man who no longer belonged to the role. His eyes were bloodshot, lips dry, hands trembling just enough to betray the rage boiling underneath the surface. Across from him sat Agent Moreno, composed and expressionless, a tape recorder already spinning on the table between them. Danielle stood to the side, arms crossed, her stare fixed and calm. But beneath her exterior was a storm, one held steady, not by satisfaction, but by discipline. She wasn't here for revenge. She was here for the truth. To live in daylight, unflinching. Daniels tried to smile, tried to find some piece of the bravado he'd carried like a shield throughout his entire career. So this is what you do? Send in one of your own, like a goddamn rat, pretending to be homeless to trap good cops. Moreno didn't blink. You're not here to question our strategy, officer. You're here because your actions and your words exposed you. Danielle leaned forward slightly. Her voice was quiet but firm. You didn't need help to fall, Daniels. All I did was give you space. You filled the rest. Daniels leaned back in his chair, jaw tightening. You don't know what it's like out there, dealing with the same trash every day. The same liars, addicts, thieves. We do what we have to. Danielle's tone hardened. What you have to? Is that what you told yourself when you slammed Trina Harris into the side of a squad car for not moving fast enough? When you laughed about putting a muzzle on me in open court? Daniels opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He turned to Moreno instead. She baited us. She wanted us to react. She gave you nothing, Moreno said flatly. And yet, you still showed exactly who you are. Meanwhile, back at the courthouse, reporters circled like sharks. Cameras flashed, microphones pointed at any official willing to speak. The city was buzzing with the story. A high-ranking FBI agent going undercover as an unhoused woman and uncovering systemic abuse in a major police precinct wasn't just shocking. It was explosive. The footage Danielle had gathered had been released to the public by midday. Not through press conferences or official memos, but through a raw, unfiltered broadcast aired across independent news platforms. Her mic had captured everything. The arrogance, the threats, the laughter, the violence. No spin, no edits, just the truth. Loud, raw, and impossible to ignore. Inside the federal conference room, a small group of officers who had worked with Danielle during the operation sat silently, watching the footage play on a mounted screen. Some of them wiped their eyes, others looked away. They had known her as a colleague, a sharp and driven agent. But none of them had known what she'd sacrificed to pull this off. Her health, her safety, her peace. And now that it was public, there was no going back. Later that evening, Danielle stood in front of the City Civilian Review Board, not to testify, not yet, but to speak directly to them as a citizen and as a professional. Her voice carried the weight of experience, of nights spent in cold alleyways, of days spent being invisible. What I witnessed wasn't just misconduct, she said, her voice clear and unwavering. It was a culture, a belief system that allowed some officers to dehumanize the very people they swore to protect because they knew no one would stop them. One board member, a gray-haired woman with soft eyes and a history in civil rights law, leaned forward. And what do you think needs to happen now? Danielle looked around the room, slowly, deliberately. Not just arrests, not just suspensions. That's the surface. This has to be structural. New training isn't enough. There has to be oversight from people who aren't wearing the same uniforms. There has to be accountability that isn't just internal. Across the city, reactions were mixed, as expected. Some praised her bravery, calling her a hero. Others accused her of entrapment, of targeting hardworking cops. But what couldn't be denied anymore was the footage. The evidence. The faces of those who had laughed at her. They weren't nameless anymore. They were visible. They were exposed. Meeks, now in a separate holding cell, had broken down during questioning. Not with tears, but with silence. A kind of stunned, hollow quiet. He had asked for a lawyer. Then asked if Danielle was watching. The agent who debriefed him said, "She doesn't need to watch. You already said enough." Back at the bureau, Danielle finally took a moment for herself in her office. Her desk was still cluttered with old files and case notes. A photo of her mother rested in the corner. She sat in silence, gazing at it, her eyes softening. She had avoided this moment for days, the moment when the mask fully came off, and she was just Danielle again. Not the agent, not the disguise, just her. She whispered softly, "I did it, Ma. I made them see." Her phone buzzed. A message from Moreno. "City Council is calling for a full hearing. They want you there." She stared at the screen for a moment, then typed back, "Let's finish what we started." Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of the precinct, rookie Officer Hall sat with his head in his hands. He had witnessed the events unfold. He had been in the room during one of the incidents Danielle had recorded, but he hadn't spoken up. Fear had kept him silent. Now, watching her dismantle an entire system alone, guilt began to gnaw at him. He walked into his supervisor's office, a trembling hand clutching his statement. "I need to talk," he said, "about what I saw." That evening, as the city skyline flickered beneath the early evening haze, a press conference was held outside City Hall. Danielle stood off to the side while the mayor, red-faced and carefully wording his speech, tried to assure the public that justice was being served. But no one was really focused on him. The cameras were on her. The questions were for her. And when the time came, she stepped forward, unflinching. "I didn't do this to become a symbol," she said, her voice calm and sharp against the hum of the microphones. "I did this because people in this city deserve to walk without fear. Because no one should have to wonder if calling the police will make them less safe. And because silence has never saved anyone." From the back of the crowd, a voice called out, "Would you do it again?" She paused for a second, then nodded. "Yes, 100 times." And in that moment, surrounded by reporters, officers, city officials, and ordinary people, Danielle Brooks, once mocked, once erased, became the voice of a city trying to wake up. But beneath it all, one truth still lingered, quiet but unshakable. There were still more names, still more officers, still more pain, and Danielle had only just begun. The days that followed were anything but quiet. The city pulsed with tension as the fallout of Danielle's revelations spread far beyond the courtroom, rippling through the precinct, the mayor's office, and the community like a wave no one had truly expected. News anchors debated whether her operation had crossed ethical lines, while civil rights groups praised the raw bravery of exposing a machine that had long operated in the shadows. Internally, the Bureau launched parallel investigations into all officers associated with the precinct. And though several were immediately suspended, the deeper probe uncovered patterns that pointed to systemic complicity. Danielle found herself not only at the center of a legal storm but also at the heart of a moral one. The city wanted answers, but it also wanted accountability, and some of it wanted blood. Behind the scenes, things were even more volatile. A group of officers, mostly young recruits and mid-level staff, requested a private meeting with Danielle. When she entered the conference room, there was a silence that felt almost sacred. These were the ones who had stayed quiet for too long. Officer Hall, the rookie who had come forward, sat closest to the head of the table. He looked up at her with a mixture of shame and hope. One of the others, a Latina officer named Rivera, finally broke the silence. "We knew something was wrong. We heard the jokes. We saw how some people acted. But nobody said anything. We didn't know how. And after what you did, we don't have an excuse anymore." Danielle didn't respond right away. She took her time, letting the weight of the moment settle into the room. "You had the power to speak," she finally said, "but you were afraid of the cost. I understand that. I lived that. But understand this too, silence doesn't just protect the guilty. It abandons the innocent. Rivera's voice cracked as she replied, "So what do we do now?" Danielle looked around the room into every pair of eyes. "You tell the truth. You write the statements. You show up. You stand in front of the people who trusted you and you say, 'We failed you, but we won't do it again.' That's how it starts." While those within the department struggled with their own reflection, the community reacted with even more complexity. Protests began to grow, not just against the named officers but against the structure that had allowed them to operate unchecked. Signs reading, "We see you now," and "Justice wears many faces," appeared on city buildings. But so did graffiti branding Danielle as a traitor, an infiltrator who had used deception to expose what others had tried to fix from within. The city was divided, and for Danielle, that divide became more personal than she expected. At a small cafe just off North Avenue, she met with Trina Harris again. Trina's face still bore faint bruises, and the anxiety in her eyes hadn't faded. But she carried herself differently now, like someone who had finally been heard. Over coffee, they sat in silence for a few minutes before Trina finally spoke. "I used to think people like you didn't care, that once you wore a badge, you couldn't feel anything for people like me." Danielle stirred her cup slowly. "Some don't. But that's why I had to do it the way I did." Trina nodded, then looked up. "But now they're coming after you, right? I've been hearing things on the street. They're saying some folks think you betrayed your own." Danielle didn't flinch. "I didn't betray anyone. I exposed the truth. If that makes people uncomfortable, then maybe they were never standing on the right side to begin with." Trina leaned forward, voice lower. "Yeah, but you know how this city is. People love you one minute, then blame you the next. You did something no one else would even dare, and now you're the one walking around with a target on your back." Danielle met her gaze. "Maybe that's the price, but I'm not afraid of being the target. I'm afraid of what will happen if no one ever takes action to bring about change." Meanwhile, the legal ramifications began to take shape. The district attorney, under growing public pressure, announced a full review of every case prosecuted involving Daniels and Meeks. Defense attorneys had already started filing motions for retrials. And for some, justice now meant being recognized not as criminals, but as individuals failed by the system. The court calendar quickly became overloaded with reopening dates. Judges scrambled to justify years of rulings, and the mayor, besieged from all directions, attempted damage control through press conferences and policy promises that no longer satisfied anyone. Inside her own agency, Danielle faced a different kind of pressure. Some colleagues praised her resourcefulness and determination. Others, behind closed doors, murmured that she had gone rogue. There were meetings she was no longer invited to, emails left unanswered. Moreno defended her fiercely, but even he could sense the shift in the air. The agency didn't like surprises, even when those surprises brought justice. One evening, he called her into his office and shut the door behind him. "They're reviewing the operation," he said, not meeting her eyes. She stood there for a moment, processing. "Reviewing? What exactly are they reviewing?" "The success," he exhaled, then continued. "No one's questioning your results, Danielle. They're questioning the method. Some believe you blurred the line between agent and activist." Her eyes narrowed. "So they're more concerned with optics than the fact that I uncovered a network of corruption inside a major precinct?" Moreno finally looked up. "You know how this works. You shook the system, and the system doesn't like being shaken." She sat across from him. "I didn't join the bureau to make it comfortable. I joined to make it accountable." He nodded slowly. "Then prepare for a fight." In the weeks that followed, Danielle continued to testify before committees, meet with community leaders, and work with internal affairs on the broader investigation. But behind each step forward, there was a shadow of consequence. Her name became a lightning rod. Her face, once unknown, was now recognized across the city. She couldn't walk through her old neighborhood without someone stopping her to offer thanks or others glaring at her with cold disapproval. Children pointed at her in the street. Strangers sent letters, some of gratitude, others filled with threats. One night, alone in her apartment, she sat with her brother Jalen. He had flown in from Chicago after seeing the footage of her revelation. The siblings sat on the balcony, staring out at the city skyline. "You did something," Jalen said quietly. "Something big." She glanced over at him. "Yeah, and now everything's different. Is it better?" She didn't respond immediately. "It's louder. People are talking. That's a start." He nodded. "But you're not done." "No," she said. "I'm not done." Yet inside her, a new weight had begun to settle. Not regret, but a recognition of the cost. The pain she had endured wasn't hers alone anymore. It had become part of the city's reckoning, and in doing so, it had marked her. She was no longer just Danielle. She had become a symbol, and symbols don't get to rest. Still, she moved forward every day, one meeting, one statement, one step at a time. Because even though the courtroom had erupted and the masks had fallen, the deeper work had just begun. And in the quiet moments, when the cameras were off and the streets were still, she asked herself the hardest question of all. If change demands sacrifice, how much more was she willing to give? The wind swept through the narrow streets of West Baltimore, whistling through the alleyways that Danielle had once called her temporary home during the undercover operation. Now she walked those same streets in plain clothes. No badge in sight, no FBI backup trailing her, no wires hidden in her coat. But every step felt heavier than before, not from fear or regret, but from the growing weight of responsibility that her choices had created. She had ignited a fire in the heart of a city already simmering with decades of pain and mistrust. Now, she could feel the burn in every conversation, in every eye that lingered too long on her as she passed. Some people nodded to her with quiet respect. Others crossed the street. Some stared at her as though she were a stranger, wearing the mask of someone they thought they knew. What she had done wasn't just a disruption. It was a shift, and the ground still hadn't settled beneath it. That evening, she met with the community coalition in a small basement church room. The same room where activists, public defenders, pastors, and former victims of the justice system had gathered long before her name was in the headlines. The energy was tense, divided, complicated. Some in the room had welcomed the exposure she brought. Others, especially those who had fought for years to build cautious bridges with the police, viewed her operation as reckless, even dangerous. They believed her methods, going undercover, staging her arrest, deceiving both the public and the department, had jeopardized their fragile progress. Danielle sat near the front of the room, listening, not speaking. A man named Kareem, an elder in the community and a former organizer from the civil rights era, finally stood and addressed her directly. "You came in like a storm," he said, his voice rough but steady. "And sometimes a storm clears the air, but other times, it tears the roof off the house before you have a plan to rebuild it." Danielle looked at him with the calm of someone who understood the layers of pain behind those words. "I didn't come here to tear anything down. That wasn't already broken," she said. "I came because too many people were already living under a roof that was caving in and calling it shelter." A younger woman, Nia, who had been organizing mutual aid for the homeless population for years, leaned forward in her chair. "You could have talked to us. You could have warned somebody. Instead, you made a move and left the rest of us to deal with the shockwaves. People are scared. Cops are retaliating. Trust is paper-thin right now." Danielle nodded slowly, her hands clasped tightly together. "I didn't make this move alone. The FBI greenlit the operation. But you're right. The community wasn't brought in, and that's on me. I made a call to stay silent for the integrity of the case. But I hear you. I do. And I carry that weight with me every day." Kareem softened his gaze but didn't relent. "Now that the curtain's been pulled back, what do you plan to do with the stage you've been given?" Danielle's voice didn't rise, but it deepened. "Use it not for speeches, not for saving face, but for policy reform, oversight. I didn't just uncover abuse. I documented a failure of accountability. And I won't walk away until there's something real in its place. Something that won't collapse the moment a camera turns off." That answer hung in the room like smoke, unsettling, but impossible to ignore. Nia looked at her again, less guarded now. If you're serious, you'll come to the next city council session and stand with us when we demand community-led review boards. Danielle nodded without hesitation. I'll be there. The room didn't erupt into applause. This wasn't a victory lap. It was a battlefield meeting in the middle of a war that had only just begun to change direction. But it was something. A step. Later that week, Danielle found herself back at FBI headquarters, this time on the other side of the conference table. A formal review board had been convened to evaluate the legality, ethics, and impact of her operation. It wasn't a trial, but it wasn't far from one either. She sat across from 5 agents, 2 legal advisors, and a representative from the Department of Justice, all of whom had reviewed the hours of footage, transcripts, and internal memos related to Operation Ghostwatch. The lead advisor, Agent Winslow, adjusted his glasses as he began to speak. Agent Brooks, while the Bureau acknowledges the success of your undercover operation and the subsequent legal action now underway against the West Precinct, concerns have been raised regarding procedural overreach and the risk of agent endangerment without sufficient backup. Furthermore, questions remain about your discretionary judgment in withholding operational details from both field offices and community organizations. Do you have a formal statement before this panel proceeds with their findings? Danielle took a breath, studying her voice. I operated under the direct approval of Assistant Director Moreno. My methods were unorthodox, yes, but every protocol deviation was recorded and justified in real time to preserve the integrity of the investigation. As for withholding information from external entities, I had to make a choice between transparency and exposure. Had I revealed my presence to the community or the department prematurely, the operation would have been compromised, and frankly, I wouldn't be sitting here testifying to its success. One of the legal advisors leaned in. Agent Brooks, your decision placed you in serious physical danger. There were multiple nights when you could have been severely harmed or killed. Why not pull the plug earlier? Her eyes didn't flinch because the abuse didn't stop at the first sign of pressure. It wasn't isolated. I had to stay long enough to show that it wasn't a few bad apples. It was the soil. The panel went quiet for a long moment. Winslow eventually closed his folder. Your testimony is on record. We'll conclude this review by the end of the week. You are not suspended pending decision, but we strongly advise against further independent action. Danielle stood, nodded, and exited the room with the slow calm of someone used to navigating rooms not designed to hold her. That evening, she returned to her old neighborhood. Not undercover, not for a case, but for herself. She walked past the corner store where Jalen had been assaulted years ago, the same one whose security camera had mysteriously malfunctioned that night. It had taken her all this time to turn pain into purpose. And even now, with headlines spinning and city officials scrambling, it still didn't feel like enough. She stopped when she saw a group of kids playing basketball with a rusted hoop nailed to a wooden post. One of them looked over, eyes wide, then ran over and called to the others. That's her. That's the woman from TV. They swarmed her with questions. Some asked if she was a real FBI agent. Others wanted to know how she could pretend to be homeless. But one boy, maybe 9 or 10, stood back a little and asked quietly, "Did it hurt when they treated you like that?" Danielle crouched down, meeting his eyes. "Yeah, it hurt a lot, but that's why I did it. So maybe one day you won't have to be afraid of people in uniform." He nodded slowly, then reached out and held her hand for just a second. That small gesture, quiet, sincere, hit her harder than any applause or award ever could. As she walked back toward her car, the city skyline in the distance flickering under the weight of streetlights and sirens, Danielle knew this wasn't the end of her journey. The operation was complete. The investigation was underway. But the real work, changing hearts, rebuilding trust, and unlearning fear, would take years, perhaps even a lifetime. Yet she was still standing, still ready. It was nearly midnight when Danielle found herself alone inside the quiet walls of the old municipal archive building downtown. She hadn't intended to stay this late, but something about the silence, the hum of the fluorescent lights above the rows of dusty case files, had a strange sort of comfort. The world outside was still loud, still burning with the aftermath of her actions, still debating her methods, still trying to reconcile the fact that a black woman who once walked the streets as a nobody had torn down a wall that had stood for decades. But in here, there was only the truth. Paperwork, forgotten testimonies, cases shelved under bureaucracy, lives lost between the lines of what was documented and what was erased. Danielle had come searching for something that had haunted her for years. The original Internal Affairs report on her brother's incident. It had vanished back then. No follow-up.
No inquiry.
No justice. But she believed now that it wasn't just negligence. It had been intentional, and she needed to see it with her own eyes. Her fingers moved carefully across the brittle tabs, tracing the years like they were scars. She pulled a box marked 2008, slid out the thick envelope labeled Use of Force, West Precinct, and flipped it open. Inside, among routine reports and vague statements, she found it, the page she had visualized 100 times in her memory. Jalen Brooks, date of incident. Witness statements, redacted. Injuries consistent with blunt trauma. Officers involved, Meeks, Daniels. Her throat tightened for a moment. Everything around her disappeared. All the noise, all the applause, all the anger gone. Just that page and the unbearable weight of knowing it had always been them. The men who had mocked her in court. The men who had called her garbage without realizing she was their reckoning in disguise. They hadn't just violated others. They had started with her family. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her. A text from Moreno. Final DOJ statement comes out tomorrow morning. We need to prep. She replied simply, I'm ready. But deep down, she wasn't sure what readiness looked like anymore. She had been running on purpose for so long that she hadn't stopped to ask herself what would be left when the mission ended. When the disguises were gone, the cameras faded, and the reports were written. Who was she then? Just a woman with too many truths and a city full of people still deciding whether to thank her or blame her. The next morning, Danielle stood in a long, high-ceilinged hall at the Justice Department, waiting to be called into a closed-door meeting with senior legal staff and federal prosecutors. Moreno stood beside her, briefcase in hand, his suit sharp but his expression worn. There's pushback, he said quietly. Some of the DC brass feel the operation compromised federal neutrality in community matters. They're worried you've become too visible. Danielle raised an eyebrow. Too visible for doing the job they gave me? Moreno gave a half shrug, the kind that spoke louder than words. This isn't about what's right. It's about what they can control. She exhaled, adjusting the collar of her jacket. Then let them try. I didn't come this far to apologize for forcing people to look. Inside the room, the tone was all cold professionalism. A row of officials sat across from her, folders in front of them, language carefully curated to sound fair but non-committal. They reviewed the data, asked procedural questions, brought up public reactions, federal liability and departmental image. But one woman, Assistant Deputy Langston, leaned forward midway through the meeting and spoke in a voice that carried a different weight. Agent Brooks, I've read every page of your field notes, every recording, every transcript. And while some of my colleagues are nervous about the blowback, I want to say something plainly. What you did exposed something no audit, no task force, no annual review ever could. You didn't just pull back the curtain. You made people look into the mirror. Danielle met her gaze. That was the point. It always was. Langston nodded slowly, then turned to the rest of the board. Whatever else happens here today, let the record show that this agent demonstrated the courage our system claims to stand for. After the meeting, as the sun began to sink behind the Washington skyline, Danielle returned to Baltimore for what would be the most emotional moment yet, meeting the families. Not just those of recent victims, but the ones whose cases had never been opened, never received attention. Mothers, sons, grandfathers, sisters, all carrying pain wrapped in silence. The Bureau had organized the meeting as part of the department's effort to rebuild trust. But to Danielle, this wasn't about policy. This was personal. The community center gym was filled with folding chairs and a heavy sense of anticipation. People looked at her not with awe but with expectation. She stood at the front, took the microphone, and paused. Then, with the raw honesty that had defined her journey, she spoke. I know some of you are still hurting. I know many of you are tired of speeches and promises. I'm not here to give you either. I'm here because I've seen what you've been living through. I felt it, and I came back to tell you, not everything is fixed. Not yet, but the silence is broken, and that's where change begins. From the crowd, a woman stood older, with a worn face and eyes that carried years of buried grief. My son was arrested 5 years ago. He never came home. They said it was an overdose, but I never got to see the report. Can you help me find the truth? Danielle's voice broke slightly as she replied, Yes, I will help you. I can't promise you justice overnight, but I can promise you won't be ignored again. After the gathering, as people filtered out with cautious hope, Danielle was approached by Officer Hall. He looked different. The same uniform, but a different presence. Humble, purposeful. I submitted my resignation, he said quietly. But not because I'm quitting. I want to work from the outside. Help rebuild what's broken. I owe you that. Danielle placed a hand on his shoulder. You owe that to yourself and to the people you serve. As the week came to an end, the city began to change. Slowly, the DOJ published its report, confirming Danielle's findings, detailing systemic abuses, and recommending a full overhaul of the West Precinct. A new task force was established, composed of both federal agents and civilians. Community oversight boards received legal approval, and officers involved in misconduct started facing real consequences. Some were prosecuted, others barred from future service. But more importantly, something deeper had shifted. People who had once been too afraid to speak up now began to step forward. Victims, witnesses, and allies. They started sharing their stories, not just in private but openly, loudly, and defiantly. And through it all, Danielle remained, not as a symbol, not as a savior, but as someone who had once been invisible and chose never to be again. In her apartment, alone once more, she stood by the window as rain traced paths down the glass. The city stretched out before her, complicated, wounded, and alive. Behind her, on the table, lay a letter, an offer from the Bureau to lead a new initiative focused on undercover reform. It was an opportunity to take her experience and create something lasting. But she hadn't responded yet because she knew that what came next wasn't just about where she worked. It was about who she chose to be now. And as lightning flickered in the distance and thunder rolled low over the street, she knew too well. Danielle whispered into the quiet room, not to herself but to every person still waiting to be seen. I see you. I'm not done. Months passed and Baltimore began to feel and look like a different city. Not because the problems had vanished, they hadn't, but because the silence had finally been shattered and people no longer turned a blind eye. Danielle Brooks became more than just a name tied to a federal operation. Her image wasn't plastered across billboards or magazines, but it lived in the minds of those who had once felt voiceless. She turned down the Bureau's offer to lead their reform task force, not out of defiance but because she realized that change from within had its limits. Instead, she took a role that allowed her to work at ground level, as director of a newly formed Civilian Justice Alliance, an independent body of investigators, social workers, legal experts, and activists. Funded partly by settlements won from exposed misconduct cases, the alliance operated without badges or sirens. Only truth, accountability, and a promise to never let another voice go unheard again. Officer Hall, no longer in uniform, returned to the streets, not as law enforcement but as a liaison between neighborhoods and public service boards. His resignation didn't signify defeat but rebirth. He went door to door, listening, learning, and rebuilding trust in places where uniforms had once only instilled fear. He wasn't celebrated like Danielle, but in quiet moments, like when a mother opened her door to ask where she could get help for her son's wrongful arrest, or when a teenager finally agreed to testify after years of silence. He felt something real, something earned. He never forgot the woman who stood against everything he had once been afraid to name. And now, every act of courage he performed was a silent vow to honor her. Kareem passed away 3 months after the reform hearings. His heart had grown weary after a lifetime of fighting, but he passed knowing that the city was finally bending, albeit slowly, toward justice. At his funeral, Danielle stood at the back, silent tears on her cheeks. He had been a mentor at a time when she needed to be grounded, reminding her that change doesn't happen through noise alone but through persistence. She remembered his words, "Storms can clear the air or tear off the roof," and she understood now that she had done both. And in doing so, she had made space for something new to be built. Trina Harris found stability. With the help of outreach programs connected to the Alliance, she received housing, therapy, and for the first time in years, a sense of safety. She began volunteering at youth shelters, speaking not as a victim but as a survivor who had seen the worst and lived. One day, she walked into Danielle's office, dressed neatly, eyes steady, and placed a small card on her desk. "Just wanted to say thank you," she said softly. "Not just for what you did for the city, but for not looking through me like everyone else did." Danielle looked at the card. It was hand-drawn, a sun breaking through gray clouds. She smiled. "You made your own light, Trina. I just moved the shadows." As for Daniels and Meeks, the city did not forget them. Both were indicted following the DOJ report. Daniels was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison for obstruction of justice, falsifying reports, and multiple counts of civil rights violations. Meeks took a plea deal, his sentence lighter, but his name permanently tied to a legacy of abuse. There were no dramatic conclusions for them, no redemption arcs, just the slow, inevitable consequences of choices made in the dark. In the final court hearing, Danielle sat quietly in the back row, not to gloat, not for closure, but to ensure that no one rewrote the story. There was no misunderstanding, no misinterpretation. They had done this to themselves. In a city council meeting broadcast live across the state, Danielle delivered her final testimony as part of the investigation's public review. She stood not behind a podium but on the floor, beside citizens who had lived through the consequences. She didn't read from notes. She didn't recite statistics. She simply spoke. "I did what I did because I was tired of asking nicely for the right to exist with dignity. Tired of seeing people treated like problems instead of human beings. Tired of watching justice used like a weapon against the very people it was supposed to protect. I'm not the hero in this story. The people who endured it all and still stood up, they're the ones we should be listening to. I just opened the door." The applause was faint at first, then gradually grew louder. But Danielle didn't revel in it. She left the room the same way she had entered, quietly, with determination. A year later, almost to the day, she stood once more in front of that same courthouse where everything had begun. Not as a defendant, not as an agent, but as a speaker at the inauguration of the city's first publicly funded legal advocacy center for victims of police misconduct. The building was simple, but inside were offices, caseworkers, trauma counselors, and investigators all trained to pursue justice without bias or hesitation. A mural adorned the outer wall, not of Danielle's face, but of raised hands, linked together, reaching toward a skyline filled with hope. Above it, in bold letters, were words that caught the attention of every passerby. "We were never invisible. You just weren't looking." Danielle stood beneath it, her heart full, her mind at peace. She didn't need applause. She didn't need headlines. She had the truth, and that was enough. Now, let's pause for a moment to reflect on this story, because maybe, as you listened, something within you stirred. Maybe it was anger, recognition, or perhaps even hope. Stories like Danielle's remind us of the power of simply being present, that sometimes just being there, witnessing, and choosing not to turn away is a revolution in itself. It challenges us to consider how many voices we've ignored simply because we didn't like the way they looked, the clothes they wore, or the neighborhoods they came from. How often have we chosen comfort over truth? And most importantly, if justice demands discomfort, are we brave enough to face it now? I want to hear from you. What did this story awaken in you? What would you have done in Danielle's place? And more crucially, what would you do now in your own community if you saw injustice standing in plain sight? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about it. And if you want more stories like this, stories that twist, reveal, and inspire, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join us here at Tales of Twist. We're just getting started.